Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you have a question about the Catholic faith, this is a great resource just for you. Now, today we're not going to be taking any phone calls or any live anything because we're doing a special mailbag edition of our program. We'll be answering some questions that you have either emailed to us or texted to us over the past couple of weeks. And so today it's going to be you, our producer Michael Birchfield, me, Tom Price, and Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Fantastic. You ready to jump into the mailbag here?
Let us jump.
Off we go. Here is one from Ronnie. Ronnie says, I had a question about the Septuagint. Specifically, I'm wondering if you think there would be any value in reading the New English translation of the Septuagint, Netz, or the recent translation of the Septuagint by Father Nicholas King, S.J., and if you would recommend either one over the other. I ask this because recently I've heard you on the show referencing St. Augustine and his apparent preference for the Septuagint over the Hebrew, and became curious about getting some exposure to what St. Augustine apparently thought of as the ecclesial translation. Thanks, Ronnie.
Oh, yes, absolutely, Ronnie. There would be great value in reading an English translation of the Septuagint. Absolutely, because, as you correctly point out, this was the text that the apostles read. It's the one from which they most frequently quoted when they wanted to quote Old Testament passages. It would have been the text that the Church Fathers were familiar with and the base text for their Latin translations. And so there are theological, philosophical emphases that come across in that text that enter into the language, the idiom of Christian theology. So to be sure. Now, which translation of the Septuagint should you read? On that, I am not an expert.
Okay.
And I wish I could advise you, but I think picking anyone up and starting to work on it's not a bad idea.
Sounds good.
You could always learn Greek, too.
There's always that. Thanks for your email, Ronnie. Here's one now from Brandon. I'm always very interested when you discuss justification, grace, and merit on your show. What is a good resource for learning more about this from the Catholic position?
Sure. So let me think for a sec. What would I send you to for a discussion of grace, justification, merit? Well, you should clearly start with the canons and decrees of the Council of Trent.
Okay.
To get the dogmatic teaching on this doctrine. You want to read the works of St. Augustine, to be sure. On the Spirit and the Letter is a good place to start, his book On the Spirit and the Letter.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the history of the doctrine, the book Justitia Dei, Justice of God,
mm-hmm.
2-volume scholarly work, actually by a Protestant historian, but one that is nevertheless very accessible and helpful, and it's a pretty straightforward history of how the doctrine of justification developed in the West. And I think that Professor McGrath really gives away the store to the Catholic Church when he admits that Luther's doctrine is a complete and total innovation, had absolutely no precedent whatsoever at all in the tradition. So that's a helpful little book. So why don't you start there?
Okay. Sounds like a plan. Brandon, thank you so much for your email. We're tackling emails today and texts that we've received over the past couple of weeks here on this special mailbag edition of Call to Communion. Here's one now from Romano. This is fascinating to me. Do time reality and outside of time reality interact and penetrate each other during the Mass?
Not in the way you mean.
Okay.
Not in the way you mean. All right, if I know where this question is coming from, the answer is no, not in the way you mean. So what this question, I think, is getting at is this. What is the relationship of Calvary, the death of Christ on Calvary, to the sacrifice of the Mass? What is that relationship? Now, you will hear bandied about sometimes in Catholic circles this idea that when we step into the liturgy, we pass out of time and space, and we're somehow mystically transported to the foot of the cross, and we're there with Jesus, and the connection of Calvary to the Mass is simply through this mystical translation process, such that the Calvary and the Mass are really just one sacrifice numerically, but that our mode of engagement is here mystical in the present rather than historical in the past. And unfortunately, I understand that position. I've heard it many times. That doctrine was actually rejected by Pope Pius XII in his encyclical Mediator Dei. And that's the wrong way to conceive of the relationship of Calvary to the Mass. Calvary happened at a historical moment in time. It was the all-sufficient sacrifice that Christ made to redeem the world, and that bloody sacrifice is never literally repeated. It's once for all. Christ dies on the cross once. The holy sacrifice of the Mass is the making present by transubstantiation of the body, blood, soul, and divinity, not of Christ as he was bleeding and dying in Calvary. It doesn't reach into the past and pull the bleeding Jesus to the present. It's rather Christ as he exists in his proper person right now, at this very instant, at the right hand of the Father, the glorified Christ who ever lives to make intercession for the saints, that is made present on the altar. That's the Jesus that's made present. So that timelessness is not involved in that, right? This is actually a very temporal Jesus who's made present. And that is the Christ, the risen, glorified Christ present in the species, that is offered to God the Father in reparation for the sins of the world in the sacrifice which is the Mass. Another way of framing that is to say that Calvary and the Mass are numerically distinct sacrifices. They're specifically the same because they contain the same victim, but the same victim at a different time and in a different mode. It's very important to insist on this because we don't want to do anything to denigrate or diminish the sacrificial character of the Mass. Each individual Mass is a distinct oblation and a distinct propitiatory offering made to God to make satisfaction for sin. Now, the efficacious power of the Mass, what gives the Mass its efficacy, is in fact Christ's death on Calvary. So the power and the fruits of Christ's death on Calvary are made present in the Mass, but the manner of offering is different. On Calvary, once and for all bloody. In the holy sacrifice of the Mass, unbloody and to be continued to the end of time. Now, in another sense, the timeless does impact the time-bound, because God, of course, who's outside of time, we draw near to him, to the timeless and eternal God, through our participation in the Mass.
Romano, thank you so much for your fascinating question. This is a special mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. In a few minutes, we'll be tackling an email from Jose, checking us out in Peru. We also have from Alistair, Charles, Dustin, Patricia, many more on this edition of Call to Communion. So glad you could join us for this special mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. By the way, the mailbag gets full, it gets empty, it's half full, whatever. From time to time, we're always looking for new emails. So please send yours to send it to ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Here's that email now from Jose in Peru. He says, "Hi, I love your show, but I'm worried about your interpretation of the Catholic doctrine on marriage. Please, where does the magisterium teach that a human couple who is over 50 and who wants to get married must understand their marriage in the light of procreation? Is it not good for a man, or it is not good for a man to be alone? Let's make for him someone to help him. That is what God says. This remains true for couples with children or without them. It remains true for older couples who have seen their children getting married, or for those who cannot have children. I am 55. My bride-to-be is 54. I know that the church does not tell me to understand that my marriage in the light of procreation, that is unrealistic. What say you?"
Well, you don't know that the church doesn't tell you that, because that's precisely what the church says that you should do. The church absolutely says you are to understand your marriage in the light of procreation. Now, so how does that apply to somebody who's 50 years old? Well, anytime any couple comes together in marriage, they do not know with certainty that they will conceive. They don't know that.
Right.
But in principle, they're open to it.
Mm-hmm.
When they seek marriage, they seek the kind of relationship that would be naturally fulfilled in the procreation of children. That doesn't mean that they will succeed in conceiving children.
I see.
But they are seeking the kind of union which, were procreation to happen, would be the natural fulfillment of that union. Now, don't put limits on God. Remember what happened to Abraham and Sarah?
Oh, yeah.
Now, God came and said, Sarah, you're going to conceive. And she laughed. And he said, you laughed. She said, I didn't. And he said, you did. And she went, oh.
Yeah.
Right? So you never know. You never know. My first Lamaze class with my wife when she was pregnant with our first son had a 50-plus-year-old woman in there. You never know what might happen. All right. So, but let's say, barring a quasi-miracle, it's unlikely that you're going to conceive a child. Well, how then does the procreative end of marriage, how do you live that out? Okay, so first of all, the purpose of your marital sexuality is not to make a sex object out of yourself or your wife. And St. Paul's admonition that husbands and wives should practice periodic continence to give themselves to prayer still holds. And the use of one's sexual faculty needs to be, in principle, open to life. So you're not going to use contraception. You're going to say, we don't need contraception. Well, granted, but you're not going to use it, right? And you wouldn't refuse a child if God gave you one. And provided that you are conducting yourself in that way, then you have the kind of relationship that the Catholic Church regards as a valid marriage. And the fruitfulness of the particular kind of friendship that emerges from that union is that it is of the nature of a parent. And even if you don't conceive your own children, from that union you will be able to live in that kind of mentoring, parental, perhaps grandparental or avuncular, I don't know what the adjectival form of like an aunt would be. Antuncular, I don't know. I'm just making this up off the fly. You'll be able to give yourself in that way to families, to extended family, and be a kind of father or mother figure to people around you. And your home can still constitute a domestic church where you witness Christ's love to the world. All of these things that flow from that particular kind of union. Now, how is that? I mean, just think for a second about how that sort of marital union would be different than, say, the union of two tennis players. Your tennis partner might be your best bud, but there's nothing that flows from the nature of the union of tennis players that it would create this kind of domestic situation, this kind of base of operations from which to live a spiritually fruitful life in a lifelong indissoluble friendship, an intimacy of man and woman given to themselves to one another, open to the procreation of life, open to the gift of self. Tennis is a great game, but it doesn't lend itself to that kind of transcendent meaning. Marriage does.
Yes, it does.
But if you want sources on the Church's doctrine on marriage, you did ask for sources.
Yes.
So here are some of the major magisterial treatments of the doctrine of marriage. So you need to look at what St. Thomas Aquinas says in the Summa Theologica, in the Supplementum when he treats the sacrament of marriage. You also want to look at his treatment of the Sixth Commandment. You want to look at the encyclical Casti Connubii by Pius XI. You want to look at John Paul II's Apostolic Exhortation, Familiaris Consortio. You want to read the Pastoral Constitution in the Modern World from the Second Vatican Council called Gaudium et Spes. And you want to look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church. These are all sources that I would go to for an explication of the Catholic teaching on marriage.
Some great resources for you there, Jose. Thank you for checking in from us in Peru. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. By the way, if you'd like to send us an email for a future show, the address is ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. Here's one now from Joel, and we've tackled this on a number of shows talking about penal substitution. Joel says, you have mentioned many times that the Church does not hold, he says doesn't not hold with the penal substitution concepts. I think there's a double negative there.
We don't hold no penal substitution.
Very good. However, in the Office of Readings for Saturday, September 22nd, from a sermon from St. Augustine, the text says, you will say, does God indeed punish every son? Yes, every one, just as he chastised his only son, born of the substance of the Father, equal to the Father in the form of God, the Word through whom all things were made. He could not be chastised. For this reason, he was clothed with flesh, so that he might know chastisement. God punishes his only Son who is without sin. Does he then leave unpunished an adopted son who is with sin? So how am I to understand this text?
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, you will find statements like this scattered throughout some of the writings of the Fathers.
Uh-huh.
Do they imply the sort of fully orbed Calvinist doctrine of penal substitution, complete with the notion of the imputation of sin and righteousness? And I say no. I think that it's fairly, to me at any rate, what you have just read is easily interpreted in light of the tradition of the church and sacred scripture that Christ entered into solidarity with sinners and experienced the suffering and the agonies of the human race that are the fruit of sin. And Isaiah 53 says, "We regarded him as rejected by God and afflicted, and the punishment that was laid upon him was our salvation, and by his stripes we are healed." So there's another passage in St. Thomas Aquinas where in the Summa Theologica, where Thomas speaks about the crucifixion, the passion of Christ as a punishment. And you think, okay, in what respect? And he says, well, in the same way that we can talk about taking bitter medicine as a punishment. All right, so this is an analogous use of the word punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And if you begin with a Calvinist doctrine of imputation and penal substitution, naturally you're going to go hunting and pecking for proof texts like this to try to derive the doctrine. But if you start with St. Augustine, if you go back into the mind of the 4th century fathers and ask yourself the question, how do they understand the death of Christ? How is it that Jesus saves us? You're not going to start with those texts and back out a doctrine of penal substitution unless you've already brought it in from the get-go. There are a few classic treatments of the atonement. I mean, the atonement's rarely an explicit subject for theological reflection in the form of a treatise in antiquity. Very few treatments. I mean, there are these scattered notions and remarks and so forth. But there are a few. One would be St. Athanasius the Great's treatise on the Incarnation, which treats the whole salvific economy from a radically different point of view, which is essentially the Irenaean point of view, same point of view that Irenaeus teaches in Against Heresies, namely that God became man so that men might become God. He sees the drama of redemption worked out not simply on the cross, but in the whole life of Christ, his assumption of the human nature, so that he might heal what had been lost in Adam. Irenaeus would say we regain in Christ what we lost in Adam, namely to be in the likeness and image of God. It's a radically different notion of what takes place in the atoning life and death of Jesus. St. Basil, of course, likened the death of Christ to a triumphant victory over the powers of sin, death, hell, and the devil, something that the Swedish Lutheran theologian brought out very clearly in his book Christus Victor, which was an analysis of the doctrine of atonement in the first 4 centuries, again interpreting it on a radically different model than what the Calvinists would later articulate. The first really lengthy exposition of the doctrine of the atonement in the Western tradition comes from St. Anselm and Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man. And that's where we find a really well-developed doctrine of sacrificial satisfaction. Again, not penal substitution. So, again, I've mentioned in the past there are good resources on this. There's a book by a Catholic theologian named Oxenham, Oxenham, that explicates the Catholic doctrine of the atonement. But also, I would encourage you to pick up a copy of the Missal, or even a missalette in the back pew of the church next time you go to Mass. Read the Eucharistic prayers.
Okay, very good.
Read the Eucharistic prayers because they contain within them the richest possible doctrine of sacrifice, and it ain't penal substitution.
Joel, thank you so much for your email. It's called to communion here on EWTN. While we're on the subject here of St. Augustine, got an email from Alistair, got that, in Yelagiri Hills, India, checking in all the way from India. Alistair says, you have read Augustine in depth. Was he open to the possibility that unbaptized children go to hell?
Was he open to the possibility that the oh gosh, yes, he was open to it.
Really?
In fact, he believed it.
Really?
Right, and later Catholic tradition corrected him on that. So when you look at St. Augustine, you have to ask the question, which St. Augustine am I looking at? And Augustine, most historians divide him into 3 periods. You talk about the early Augustine, the middle Augustine, and the late Augustine.
Mm.
And Augustine himself suggests this division because one of the last books he wrote in his life was the Retractiones, his retractions. And he went back over his entire corpus. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing because it helps historians date the text and so forth. And Augustine says, yeah, way back in, well, he didn't have the same calendar we did,
Yeah.
but, 395, I wrote this book and I said this. Yeah, I didn't know what I was talking about back then. I've changed my mind. Now here's what I believe,
Wow.
So Augustine changed over the course of his life.
Have other writers ever done that? Have
Changed over the course of their life or written a retraction?
written a retraction?
I'm sure they have. That one, now, I did my doctoral work on a Protestant theologian, John Calvin.
Yeah.
And John Calvin was always going back and revising and editing and changing his earlier work, but not acknowledging that he was doing that. So that you
Oh.
see development in him, but
Okay.
he doesn't acknowledge his own
On the
development.
sly. Okay.
But I'll tell you a funny story about development in St. Augustine. One of the first papers I wrote in grad school was on the Christian doctrine of the resurrection in the writings of St. Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
And my thesis was that the earlier in Augustine you get, the less Augustine understood the doctrine of the resurrection. And he was basically a Platonist, meaning that he believed in the immortality of the soul and the dissolution of the body, and that's all she wrote. And as he began to study Scripture more, he got a clearer and clearer conception of the idea of a bodily resurrection.
Uh-huh.
And so by the end of Augustine's career, he has a pretty hard doctrine of resurrection. And I compared it to, if you ever watch the old Star Trek episodes, and you see the characters that get beamed, through the little transportation device,
Yeah,
teleportation device.
Yes.
And before they show up, they're just kind of this little hazy, fuzzy shadow.
Yeah.
And then they kind of go, zzz, thunk, and then they're there. And I was like, that was what Augustine's doctrine of resurrection was like. It started out this little hazy shadow, and by the end of his career, it goes zzz, thunk, and gets solidified, So the earlier Augustine was actually probably softer on this doctrine.
Interesting.
And possibility of universal redemption or something. By the end of his career, after he's had his conflict with the Pelagians, he had a straight-up doctrine of infant damnation. The subsequent Catholic tradition went, Augustine, we really like you, but not here. We don't like you here. We're going to reject that. And Thomas Aquinas famously rejected Augustine's doctrine of the damnation of infants. And to answer that, gave us his hypothesis of the possibility of limbo for infants, which is not a doctrine of the church. It was just Thomas's hypothetical alternative to Augustine's doctrine of infantile damnation, which is not the dogma of the church. It was just his private theological opinion.
Okay. We do appreciate hearing from you, Alistair, in India. Fascinating and always good to unpack St. Augustine a little bit. Well, in a few moments here, we're going to be getting lots more emails. We've got one coming up from Dustin in Fargo, North Dakota, who's got a Muslim question in mind. We're also going to hear from Lori, who was visiting Quebec. You've been to Quebec, haven't you?
Oui.
Okay, well, she's got a question about Quebec and something that she saw there. And also, here's a very interesting one from Kyle in Missouri regarding Protestant justification. And couple other ones here. Maria has one about homosexuality. Just a plethora, or a passel, if you will, of great questions that we've received over the past couple of weeks here on EWTN's Call to Communion. I want to put out the call one more time here, a little call for entries, if you will, or a call for action. If you would like to send us an email for a future show, you can send that to ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com, or you can just call us as we're doing one of our live shows Monday through Friday. This is not a live show. We're recorded today, but we've got lots more straight ahead on this mailbag edition of Call to Communion on EWTN. It's the mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Glad that you're with us today. We're Going through a whole bunch of emails we've received over the past few weeks, and one of them is from Charles, who says, my question is this: how do I convince a very otherwise faithful Catholic father of 8 that he really needs to stop being so anti-Pope Francis? How do you make that argument?
So, I have a policy, personal policy,
Yes.
as a Catholic radio personality, not to take policy positions. Like, my policy is not to take policy positions.
Okay.
That's true on politicians. That's true on members of the church hierarchy, because anytime someone exercises jurisdiction, executive authority, they do so inspired by a philosophy. It could be a political philosophy, could be a pastoral philosophy. And the beautiful truth about the Catholic Church is that, look, there have been hundreds, thousands perhaps, of different ideological or pastoral philosophical assumptions that have guided ministry in the church. And from the point of view of hindsight, with 2,000 years experience, we can see that popes and bishops and priests have done just absolutely astonishingly fruitful and helpful things by way of pastoral ministry, or sometimes political maneuvers as well, that have been to the great benefit of church and society. Sometimes they've done some just really stupid stuff, right? So I keep my opinions to myself on, like, who's doing a good job and who's doing a bad job, unless you're dead 200 years, and then I'll tell you what I think.
No, okay.
But Catholic loyalty to the church, loyalty to your bishop, to your priest, and to the Pope, requires you to admit that the office holder is capable of doing a good or bad job. It does not require you to believe that a particular office holder has done a good job or has done a bad job. I mean, you're not obligated. Let me give you an illustration.
Okay.
All right. And this is, I think, a wonderful, wonderful illustration. Cardinal John Henry Cardinal Newman, who is now Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman, is very soon to be Saint John Henry Cardinal Newman, and I suspect there's a pretty decent shot will one day be Doctor of the Church Saint John Henry Cardinal Newman. He's not yet, so I'm no prophet, so maybe he won't be. But he's a highly regarded Catholic theologian in the 19th century, and a great theorist on papal infallibility and the nature of the church and so forth. Believed that the Pope was infallible. He believed that doctrine. He believed it before the First Vatican Council defined it. First Vatican Council defined the doctrine. Newman believed it before the definition.
Okay.
He believed in the doctrine after the definition. He thought the council was a bad idea. He thought you shouldn't define it. He thought it was true. He thought it was part of the Catholic faith. He held it. He thought it was a bad idea to define it. Why do I bring this up? The decision to define the dogma is infallibly true. But a prudential decision is neither true nor false. It's good or bad. Right? Like my decision to eat oatmeal instead of blueberries is not true or false. It might be good or bad. And the church is never guaranteed to make only good prudential decisions. Even about something important like the definition of a dogma. Newman thought the church could say something true badly. She could say something true badly.
I get it.
You don't have to say every true thing. And he thought it was not an opportune moment. Now, you can disagree with Newman. You can say, well, Newman, it was great we had the council. And I kind of think it was good we had the council. I don't necessarily agree with Newman that the council was a bad idea. But I bring him up to illustrate how someone could be just devotedly loyal to the church and to the doctrines of the church, and yet state publicly, I think you're really doing a silly thing, and you ought not to do it.
Yeah.
Now, that's what loyalty. The church is not a personality cult, where trust in the magisterium or in the divine authority of the church requires me to follow every jot and tittle that some prelate says and hold that as if it were gospel truth. It's not, any more than St. Peter was infallible when he was disfellowshipping the Gentiles in Antioch. On the contrary, St. Paul had to come to Antioch and give him what for? Chewed him out, told him he was doing a bad job. All right. Now, that being said, let's say you think that your priest or pastor or your pope or whatever is not doing a great job. Well, what do you try to gain by talking about it? Like, who are you trying to help? St. Paul says, let your speech be seasoned with salt. Only speak what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. All right? If you think that some person in the church is doing a bad job, whether it's the pope, the bishop, or your priest, who are you helping by bad-mouthing him? Who are you building up according to their needs?
Nobody.
All right? And so there is a time to criticize members of the hierarchy, and there's a way to do it that's respectful, that's deferential. There's a venue, there's a context, but there's a way not to do it. And there are probably a lot of ways not to do it. I'll name one. You ain't the Pope. So don't do it like you're the Pope.
Yeah.
You know, do it like you're the son of the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, do it like you believe that this person has their authority by God and really holds this office and is really held responsible by God for souls. Do it with prayer, do it with respect, do it with charity, and do it with love. Or do it like the Blessed Virgin Mary did. She didn't open her mouth very much.
That's true.
You know, St. Francis of Assisi was born at a time when there was a lot to criticize about popes.
Oh, yeah.
And his response was to strip off his clothes and give them to lepers, pick up, you know, some tools and start rebuilding a broken down church, and do everything in his power to imitate Christ. So when you're living as holy as St. Francis of Assisi, who said nothing to criticize the hierarchy in a time when it was deserving of criticism, then, you know, then might be the time to really start cutting down people.
Appreciate your email there, and that is from Charles, I believe it is. This is a call to communion here on EWTN. Marilyn, checking in on Facebook, wants to know if a young child cannot confess a bad sin through many confessions because it is so hard to express their sorrow and fear, are all the sins confessed not valid through the absolution of the priest?
Man, I wish I knew the specifics behind this question. I really wish I knew the specifics. If we're talking about a child, a young child, who, I mean, it's hard for me. First of all, I have a really hard time wrapping my head around how an 8 or 9 year old child is going to have committed a mortal sin.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but that's a tough one. Okay. So, and if it's not a mortal sin, you don't have to confess it. And if I'm the parent and I'm guiding this child, one of the things I'm going to be very attentive to is please, dear God, do not let me impose my scrupulosity on this child. Nothing will turn a kid off from the confessional or from the church more than a neurotic scrupulosity about sin.
Yeah.
You know, the confessional is the tribunal of God's mercy. This is me reconciling with someone that I love. The best model for understanding the confessional is how would I reconcile with my dad, who I love? I mean, I have a great dad. You know, how would I reconcile with my dad or my wife or my child if I had wronged them and we were alienated? And what kinds of things would alienate me from someone who loved me? You know, that's the best model. And so make sure you have the right image of God, who God is. Sin is not just violating arbitrary precepts of some tyrannical deity who's out there to get you. All right? Sin is when we really have loved ourselves wrongly and more than God and neighbor, when we put ourselves forward, you know, and trample down someone else in their dignity. And I'm having a hard time understanding why that kind of saying I'm sorry would be impossible to give without the specifics behind it. And I'm suspicious that there may actually be not a fearful child, but maybe a scrupulous parent behind this question.
Oh, could be. All right. Well, I hope that's helpful for you, Marilyn. We do appreciate your checking in with us on Facebook. It is a special mailbag edition of Called Communion here on EWTN. Mentioned earlier that Dustin in Fargo, North Dakota checked in. Dustin says, my Muslim friend claims that the Quran has detailed embryology that wasn't known or available to Muhammad. He uses this to justify that the Quran is the Word of God. Can you help me address this with him? I've already addressed the theories of Hippocrates, Galen, and Yehudi with him, but I don't have enough knowledge of them or the topic to make a strong argument. And again, that's from Dustin.
Okay, thanks. Well, a couple things. First of all, I'm not an expert in the Quran. I would really like to see the evidence that the Quran had biologically accurate embryology that has only been discovered in recent years that was inaccessible naturally to Muhammad, and that verifies. I mean, I'd really like to see the evidence for that claim.
Yeah.
And I know how devotees tend to read sacred texts, right? And I know that sometimes there's a lot of really creative eisegesis. Eisegesis is reading into a text something.
Oh,
that's
this
not there.
means this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and I would like to, you know, I would test that claim first of all on its merits. Now, that being said, I also don't know unless you're talking about at the microscopic level.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, medieval Arabians had the ability to vivisect. You know, so embryological knowledge was not totally unavailable to them, inaccessible to them. But I'm not conceding the claim. I don't actually believe the claim. I'm not conceding the claim. But even if it were the case that you produced some text for me from, 4th century India that had an accurate scientific description of some phenomenon that was unknown in the West or other parts of the world, I'm not getting divine inspiration out of that. I'm thinking, okay, so here would be a culture that knew something scientifically that we didn't. All right, well, I mean, like Charles Darwin learned a lot of things about the evolution of species when he took his trip around the world. I don't hear anybody making a claim for the divine inspiration of the origin of the species.
No.
I think it's a non sequitur. So I knew a scientific fact. Therefore, God inspired me. Don't think so.
No. Okay.
And I think there are other reasons to discount the claim of inspiration.
Okay. Well, very good. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Here's one now from Patricia. Is there a specific guideline on the use of medication for a couple having difficulty conceiving? Anything you can shed light on there?
Okay. Well, you don't want to use medication that is abortifacient or contraceptive.
Right.
All right. That's clear. And we don't want to we don't want to use any technology that separates conception and procreation from the sexual act and the union of man and woman. All right. We're not instrumentalizing human sexuality or human reproductive power, in a test tube to make little robo babies for the future. We're not trying to come up with humanity 2.0 here. Because the procreation, the conception of children is intimately connected to the persons of their parents in a particular kind of union, right? That's more than merely biological. So we don't want to do anything to frustrate that. Medication that simply enhances the natural function of the human body, and I'm certainly not an expert in this, all right? And for more information, I would look at the Catholic Bioethics Center, who kind of keeps up to date on all this kind of stuff. But medication that causes the body to function in accord with its nature when properly functioning. I mean, that's what all medication does. It tries to return us to the natural state that we ought to have if everything's working properly. That kind of thing is in accord with human dignity. We're fixing something that's broken. Right. We're not rearranging things in a new way that God didn't intend. As long as we're fixing something that's broken, then that's okay.
Okay. And Patricia, thank you so much for your email. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Lori in Washington, D.C. says, I recently visited the beautiful St. Anne de Beaupré yesterday while visiting Quebec from the U.S. I was surprised to see astrology mosaics in the narthex. Each month in French was depicted with a symbol, for example, a crab mosaic for June. Now, it's always been my understanding that the Catechism of the Catholic Church refutes all forms of astrology. Any thoughts on this? First of all, did I pronounce Anne de Beaupré properly?
I think so.
Oh,
So I got a couple thoughts. First of all, I don't know enough about the shrine. I don't know when it was constructed, and that's somewhat relevant to the answer I'm going to give you. First of all, the fact that an artist uses some figure or form or trope from some culture somewhere does not mean that that artist or the patron that commissioned that artwork endorses the worldview or the religious practice that stands behind that image or that trope or that form. Any more than the use of Greek columns in Catholic architecture implicates us in the worship of pagan deities, since those very same columns were used to construct pagan temples to their gods. So that's, I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis, Anglican writer, Christian writer. In his Chronicles of Narnia, he populates his novels with figures from Greek and Roman mythology. I'm a big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, Catholic writer, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. He bases his fictional universe on Icelandic pagan mythology. The use of these forms does not imply that I'm engaging in the practices that those cultures engaged in when they used those forms.
Right.
So you can have an artistic purpose that's different. That's number one. Secondly, astrology is wrong. And there have been periods of Catholic history, however, I'm thinking particularly around the Renaissance and late Middle Ages, when even though there was a strong tradition condemning astrology going all the way back to St. Augustine, well, even before St. Augustine, but Augustine writes about it quite explicitly, when Catholics, and not the church, you understand, I'm just about individual Catholic intellectuals, toyed around with it a little bit more, wondering if they could kind of tease out of it a scientific basis. And it became quite popular, in fact, in early Renaissance, late Renaissance, and late Middle Ages, to toy around with that stuff, and to see what we might be able to work into it. And they would try. Some people were trying to coordinate astrological projections with biblical prophecy, for example. Well, that didn't go over too well. It didn't work, and they were wrong, and they put it aside again after messing around with something they shouldn't have messed around with. Look, Catholics today would never mess around with something they shouldn't mess around with,
never,
right?
never.
So there's also the possibility. I don't know when Anne de Beaupré was built, and I don't know what artistic influences came to bear, but there, because something is wrong doesn't mean that no Catholic anywhere ever did it.
Sure.
So that's the other thing, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the Universal Church endorses it.
There you go. Lori, we hope your visit to Quebec was a wonderful one. Sounds like she had a great time there. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Kyle in Missouri says, what in general is the Protestant justification for holding to the early creeds from the Catholic Church?
Yeah, thanks. Different justifications depending on which Protestant theologian you talk to. Right? So if you're Luther, if you're John Calvin, if you're Ulrich Zwingli, if you're Cranmer, how do you justify radical innovation? How can you claim to be the Christian church if you are radically innovating and breaking with 1,500 years of tradition? Different Protestants have answered that question differently. But let me tell you how the magisterial reformers of the 16th century, especially Calvin, answered that charge. This is the picture that they suggested. It's false. They're wrong. But this is what they argued.
All right.
They said, imagine the early church is pristine, is pure, has everything right. And then the papacy begins to rise in importance in the early Middle Ages, and with the papacy, as they would say, papistical superstition, smoke and mirrors.
Yes.
And because of the rise in Roman authority, the popes had an interest, this was their argument, in suppressing the light of the gospel. And so they bury the true church and the true gospel and the true faith under this mountain of medieval superstition. And here come the reformers in the 16th century, and their job is to blow away the smoke, clear away the ashes and the cinders, to reveal that shining, pristine faith that to a certain extent was buried there all along. And that's not how it worked, but that's the way they argued. All right, and in suggesting that, they were trying to tie their own communities in Switzerland and Germany and France back to the church of the first 4 centuries. They wanted very much to make the claim that they were in continuity with the church of Augustine, with the church of Chrysostom, with the church of the Cappadocians, with the church of the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople and Ephesus and Chalcedon, because they understood biblically and historically the importance of the doctrine of Catholicity and apostolic succession, and they wanted to lay claim to that mantle. Because they wanted legitimacy, they wanted authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, later Protestants came up with different justifications. So, like in the Christian church movement started by Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, for instance, they said, oh, no, we're not interested in continuity with the ancient church because everybody got it wrong except us, including Nicaea. And they were like, okay, you got the New Testament and then the Apocalypse, right? And then we built it back again. And that same kind of impetus is what motivated a guy like Joseph Smith to say, I'll do you one better. I'll invent a whole new religion and call it antiquity, call it the first century.
Yeah.
But that's the rationale.
Okay, sounds good. And thank you so much for your question, Kyle. I think we have time for maybe one more here. This is from Beth. I have heard people talk about a third and final Jerusalem temple. Then that once it's rebuilt, that will signal the end of the world is near and Jesus' second coming is at hand. Is that what Catholics believe?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Jesus, the only third temple we know anything about was the temple of his body, which is the church. You had the temple built by Solomon. You had the reconstructed temple in Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile.
Mm-hmm.
That was destroyed in 70 A.D. And then you have the people of God reconstituted around Christ, the Messiah, and his apostles, which is the true Israel, all right, and the fulfillment of all that messianic expectation. And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Destroy this temple. 3 days I'll raise it up again. The temple he was speaking of was his own body. We come into that temple. We participate in that. We become members of that body through holy baptism, built on the foundation, the columns of the 12 apostles and their teaching. And that's the temple that will endure till the end of time, and all other temples and all other kingdoms will fall before it. That's the one that'll never be destroyed.
Very good. And we'll sneak in one more here from Enrique. In the Latin tradition, we have many different Marian apparitions that are vetted by the Church. Do the Eastern churches have their own private revelations that are also vetted by the Church in the same way? I guess that would be Marian apparitions in the Eastern churches.
I am not an expert on every purported or authenticated Marian apparition in the history of the Church.
Mm.
There are apparitions of saints and miracles and so forth in the Eastern tradition. I don't have a catalog of all of them, but those Eastern churches that are in communion with Rome would certainly submit any purported apparition to the judgment of the Holy See.
Okay, very good. And in the 1 minute that we have left, Susan says, I've been wondering what happened to the gifts that Jesus received at his birth. Today I heard you mention giving away the gifts. Could you please expand on this topic? Is there any scripture about it?
Oh, that was a joke.
Oh, that was a joke?
That was a joke. If I remember the instance, I said, I was talking about how difficult Mary's life was.
Uh-huh.
She really did. She had a very, very, very tough life. I mean, she signed up for suffering. And, she and St. Joseph went down to Egypt, and they were immigrants, and they didn't speak the language, and they had to make do, doing carpentry and whatnot for 10 years and 12 years until it was safe to go back to Judea. And so they lived in poverty and ignominy, and it was pretty darn difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of cracked a joke, and I said, you can just imagine Mary and Joseph going, shucks, if we hadn't gotten rid of all that gold, frankincense, and myrrh, we could have lived like kings.
That's
You know?
right.
But I was just kidding. You know.
Okay.
We don't have any idea what happened to it.
Okay, got it.
But
Well,
we could, I mean, I think we could surmise that they would have shared with the poor.
That's a good.
Yeah.
That's a good assumption. All right, very good. And we've got plenty more emails. We're going to have to get to the rest of those on a future mailbag edition of Call to Communion. And we also chip away at some of these emails during each of our live shows, which we do Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And by the way, we also have an encore for you this evening and every weekday evening. So just in case you missed the 2 p.m. Eastern airing, you can also hear it at 11 p.m. Eastern. And then Michael Birchfield snags what he thinks is the best show of the week, and he will place that in our Sunday play-out system so that we can play that for you on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Dr. David Anders, thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Tom.
Keep it right here on EWTN for solid Catholic programming 24 hours a day. On behalf of Michael Birchfield, I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders. See you next time here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.